It was daytime and the sun shone high in the sky. That day marked the beginning of the Survival Olympiad. The tournament would take place in the Magic Tower, a place made up of countless spaces whose height and width were impossible to measure. Inside it awaited this year's map for the survival tournament, the jungle of the Red and Black Mountain. When night fell, Sancho and the others grabbed their weapons and began to run through the jungle. Their eyes shone with determination, and each one had the assigned health points. They were aware that students from each school were summoned at random locations by teams, and the most important rule of the tournament was to survive by adapting to the relentless environment of the mountainous jungle, without letting their assigned HP shield reach zero. At that moment, a monster stomped on the ground with force to gain momentum. Noticing this, Piggy's attention fixed on it, and his eyes filled with fear and surprise. A giant monster with eyes shining with fury appeared in front of them and began to roar. Sancho and the others stopped running, and their attention was fixed on the monster. The monster clenched its fists and lunged at them. It landed on top of them and struck with all its strength, breaking the ground into pieces. Sinclair's eyes began to shine with seriousness, and using her powers, she summoned a powerful shield around them to protect from the monster's attack. Sancho, who was standing in front, grabbed his axe and started staring at the monster. He was the tank, Sinclair was the healer, Piggy was the strategist, Tudor was the DPS, and Bianca was the archer. There existed a rule that allowed participants to survive by fleeing from magical beasts of the jungle or, on the contrary, hunting them to earn points. With a serious gaze, Piggy turned to Tudor and said that they would distract the beast until the next attack. He also told Sancho that, once his shield was depleted, he should take care of escorting Sinclair and Bianca. Tudor began to observe Piggy and nodded his head. Then, Piggy turned to Bianca and Sinclair and asked them that, while he and Tudor distracted the beast, they should aim at its vital points. Sinclair, who was holding her magic staff, and Bianca began to observe Piggy and nodded their heads. The monster became enraged, clenched its fist, and began charging toward them, ready to attack again. Seeing this, Piggy and the others started running toward it and decided to set off. They were willing to defeat this beast. With a furious gaze, the beast attacked with all its strength, but Tudor jumped and dodged the attack, making its fist hit the rocks. With a worried expression, Piggy crouched down and also dodged the attack at the last second. The monster got even angrier and started hitting with all its strength, and while it was distracted, Sinclair extended her hands and applied a buff to Bianca. She stood up and began aiming at the monster with her bow, ready to shoot. Sancho stood in front of them to protect them from a possible attack. Several seconds passed, and seeing that Bianca still hadn't shot the bow, Tudor's eyes filled with confusion. Sinclair grabbed her magic staff tightly, closed her eyes and concentrated. Bianca's eyes, who was aiming at the monster with the bow, began to glow. She started to concentrate all her power on the tip of the arrow and mentioned that she was almost ready to shoot. After charging the attack, she fired. The arrow was so powerful that it pierced part of the monster's body. Not long after, it lost its life and fell to the ground. Piggy turned around and his eyes widened in surprise since the monster had been very close. Tudor, who was observing the course of the monster, couldn't help but wonder if Bianca had shot late on purpose. Bianca placed her hands on her waist and with an arrogant expression mentioned that she shouldn't have bothered saving Tudor and thought that maybe she should have shot later. Once she opened her eyes, she felt somewhat confused. The eyes of Sancho and Sinclair filled with fear and concern. They panicked and asked Tudor and Piggy to run away. Tudor and Piggy turned around and felt somewhat confused. They were not aware that a powerful burst of fire was approaching them. The burst of fire exploded, creating a great explosion in the area. The person who had summoned the burst of fire extended his hand toward them and felt furious and called the students from Colosseo Academy insects. It was none other than Philippus. He extended his hand, and while his body was surrounded by powerful flames, with an arrogant expression made it clear that, for him, it made no sense that they were above the magic tower in the hierarchy. Currently he had 83 HP points. The reality was that prey that could add points could also be people. Granel was walking through the jungle. He had 77 HP points. His eyes were full of exhaustion and his face full of sweat. Using his hand, he wiped the sweat. His energy vanished just by walking through the forest, and he wondered how it was possible that a hellish jungle like this existed in the real world. He also questioned where the hell the others had gone. He began to imagine Vikir and the Baskerville triplets. Granel started sweating like crazy, and his eyes widened with rage upon noticing that they had ventured so recklessly, and he couldn't help but wonder if they had already been eliminated and teleported to the waiting room. He began to remember what had happened in the train car. According to him, they were complete useless people. He thought with regret that if only he hadn't let his guard down that time, he would have put those guys in their place properly. Just then, a strange aroma began to spread through the air, and this caught Granel's attention. He couldn't help but blush and put his hand over his stomach. His mouth watered as it was the smell of food. He wiped his mouth with his hand and, with a smile, began to follow the trail of the smell. Giving off the aroma of food in the middle of the forest was like putting up a sign that said, "I'm here, come get me." Not long after, in the distance, he saw a campfire and thought he had found free food, but to his surprise, he triggered the trap that was on the ground. Upon feeling this, he looked down, and his eyes widened in fear and surprise. The rope wrapped around his foot, lifting him upside down. Granel panicked and started screaming like a madman. He didn't know who had set the trap and demanded to be brought down immediately. The person who had set the trap was an archer. They began walking toward Granel and felt somewhat confused to see that he had triggered the trap. Granel's attention fixed on them, and his eyes widened in surprise, leaving him in shock. The people who had placed the trap were none other than Vikir and the triplets. Our boy had 100 HP points, while the others had 95, 96 and 97. Vikir began to gaze at the ground. The triplets put their hands on their waists and began to look at Granel with contempt. For him this was a disgrace. They deactivated the trap and brought Granel down, and then they sat around the bonfire. While the triplets were silent, Granel sat next to Vikir and began to show a forced smile. They started to prepare some meat on the bonfire. Granel's attention was fixed on the tent, and his mind was filled with surprise. There was not only food but also an improvised tent, which made him wonder who could have done all this. The triplets began to stare at him. High Burrow said that the commoner Vikir had done all this. Middle and Low Burrow nodded their heads. With a curious expression, Granel began to point at Vikir with his finger and asked if a commoner had done all this, dismissing the idea as a lie. He wondered how a nobody like Vikir could achieve something like this. Our boy began to gaze toward the ground in silence. The triplets began to stare at him, and their eyes started to shine with rage. Granel raised his hands and panicked, saying that he just wanted to know how Vikir had done all this. The smell of food began to pass under Granel's nose. He couldn't help but clench his teeth tightly and feel furious. He wondered why he, a member of the 7 great families, had to worry about the opinion of a damn commoner, and also had the feeling that those idiots from the Baskervilles were covering for him. He put his hand over his stomach and let out a sigh. Vikir and the others began to watch in silence. The triplets couldn't help but laugh at him. Noticing this, Granel felt even more furious. He was so humiliated that he wished to die. Vikir brought a piece of meat close to Granel's face and mentioned that they were roasting it to attract monsters, but if he wanted, he could eat a little since they had already eaten. His attention focused on it, and his eyes widened in surprise. His mouth watered. He began to extend his hand to grab the piece of meat and asked why Vikir was being generous with him. The eyes of our boy began to shine with malice, and a smile spread across his face when he said that he was being generous because Granel was the leader of the team. Granel felt somewhat confused. Vikir knew that Granel's poison could also be useful in the jungle and thought that he might be useful to them later. Granel closed his eyes and couldn't help but cry. He was thinking about that damn commoner. He, who had looked down on him so much, realized that Vikir was better than he had thought. He took the roasted meat and with tears in his eyes began to eat. His HP points went from 77 to 90. Vikir and the others stood watching in silent amazement. Later, someone shot an arrow at high speed, which lodged into the leg of a monster that was fleeing. The person who had shot the arrow was Vikir. Next to him was Granel, who extended his hands and with a gaze full of determination began to use his poison power. With their eyes shining with excitement, the triplets began charging at the monster. The monster with the shape of a bear and horse got enraged. It turned around and started to roar. But the triplets attacked quickly and started to cause wounds to the monster. Not long after, it lost its life and fell to the ground. Vikir revealed that they had already hunted 30 beasts. The triplets were happy since this was very easy. Vikir looked at the ground and revealed that, if he wanted to secure a place within the top 10, he would have to hunt more. Granel's attention and his mind were filled with curiosity. He did not know why only Vikir hunted monsters instead of other students, since he remembered that hunting students gave more points. Vikir raised his head and sunk into his thoughts. Granel became even more curious, not knowing what he had in mind. Vikir's eyes began to shine. This felt familiar, the survival score, the score for hunting monsters, even the points obtained by making others fall behind, all of it was familiar. Even back then, he had avoided the gazes of others, caught the monster and obtained first place in the tests. That testing site also felt like home. However, his senses, enhanced after becoming a sword master and after entering the Red and Black Mountain inside the magic tower, were warning him for some reason. Vikir began to gaze toward the ground, not knowing what was happening. But he noticed that something was approaching. While they were distracted, not long after, something began to move toward them at great speed. Without losing a second, with a killer gaze, the triplets drew their swords and stood in front of Vikir. Our boy drew his bow, ready to attack. Granel with a confused gaze extended his hands and also prepared to fight. His eyes widened in surprise and confusion. He could not believe what his eyes were seeing. It was Sinclair, who now only had 38 HP points. Her body was full of scratches and her clothes were torn. She put her hands on her knees and with a gaze full of fear began to pant heavily. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part,